So what is meant to be a moment of celebration, I can only imagine, right? It becomes that, of course, over time, is actually a moment of confusion and disbelief between the followers of Christ. Some who have met these angels and believe Christ has risen, and others who don't quite believe yet. Even Peter says he goes to the tomb and he sees linen laying there, and he looks at it and he wonders what's been going on. I mean, it's a natural, I think, reaction. But we forget that Christ himself said that he would rise after 3 days. I can relate to this story on many different levels, but the key one for me today on Easter Sunday is just this idea that God is a living God, that Christ is living and loving today. Because often I think that idea is dismissed. I feel like partly because of how Christianity has used his name, there's a general idea that Christ is dead, that Christianity is dead, let's say. And I think there's some truth to that. We reflected on our Palm Sunday message about how Swedenborg, the unintentional namesake of our denomination, wrote in the 18th century that he believed the Catholic Church was dead because of all their heinous actions. And that today we see a revitalization of that church under Pope Francis. And I think that can't help but happen, and in a way it's happening with the Catholic Church, with Christ, with our understanding of Christ in the world today. I think I see the glimmers of it already. If you're on social media, you'll notice many people pointing out that the words of Christ are often words of resurrection, of social justice and love and kindness and openness. He did not set out to create a religion, but was a man who wanted to uplift health in those around him, uplift healthy connection with the earth, healthy connection with spirit and life and love and community in all its various ways. We hear it in all his messaging. It says that he preached a sermon, a exclamation of repentance, of turning around, changing, turning away from our outside orientation, our outside attachments, addictions, identifications, and realizing that we're one with the Spirit, that we're in unity with God, which he invited often to us, for us, saying that he wanted us to have unity with God and awareness of that unity in the same way that he did, a unity with him and God as one. I think that can be a tricky idea because we think, well, what would it take for me to be one with God? One with God. But honestly, the scriptures point to the fact that we must just let go of everything that's not one with God. All our deep identifications with our sense of individuality that's removed from God. We're so caught up in every thought almost. We give it so much credence. We give our identification, our defensiveness, our judgment so much credence that Christ saw this and said, this type of attachment, this kind of lust, this kind of hate, this kind of anger, these addictions are driving you away from the love that's at your core, a love for others as yourself. And so in a way, when we talk about the resurrection of Christ, we have to talk about the resurrection of his message. He embraced all people, no matter their tradition, right? He didn't say, well, you have to become Christian first. I have to baptize you in the river. You have to get the tattoo, which Malik's getting today. But no, he did not say that. He invited people to turn to an awareness of God. Indeed, often inviting them to follow him. But he said that in many different ways to different people. Because Christ himself was an embodiment, a person who allowed God to flow through him. Swedenborg believed that Christ, throughout his life, went through a process of glorification, that he let go of more and more of his limited human side, which isn't really human at all, according to Swedenborg, to his divine human side, his divine spirit, the soul of Jehovah. I think Swedenborgians can often also get distracted by these details, putting it all on Christ and forgetting that we are invited by Christ to the same sort of process. Swedenborg wrote about it as well. He called it regeneration. He says this was similar to the Lord's glorification. And so our invitation on Easter Sunday is to remember how God has spoken to each of us, because it'll be different than what I believe, what I think, in some way, I'm sure. To remember the core of Christ's teachings, maybe even to crack open a Bible, take a look, and invite the Spirit of Christ to resurrect in our lives today, to resurrect in our behavior, and honestly, I think to resurrect in our beliefs. Because that's ultimately what we're often talking about. We believe we're this person who's addicted and removed from God. We believe maybe it's not an addiction, but we're this being that has these habits that can't help but do this or that. We believe we're not someone connected deeply with Christ, that turning to Christ in the moment and meditative or prayerful contemplation won't really help anything. And those beliefs limit us because they put us in our limiting identification, our limiting conceptual thinking, our analysis of everything. We're always outward, judgment, thought, defense. We feel vulnerable because we identify with our bodies, we identify with our minds, we identify with our expressions. We know people judge every moment. If we identify with these things, how could we not feel defensive? How could we not feel vulnerable? But Christ taught us true vulnerability in a way, and allowing for the crucifixion, as it says, strangely enough, he allowed himself to die, allowing himself to let go of his body, quite literally, funny enough. And even when he grieved, he did grieve on this path. We hear about it in the Garden of Gethsemane. There was some turmoil there, as Swedenborg said, maybe in his process of glorification, there was a process of humiliation as well. A process of humiliation, of letting go of his limited sense of self, his fears. It doesn't mean batting them down. It doesn't mean beating ourselves up as that next thought isn't quite like Christ. But it is releasing a little bit of the belief in them, the belief in those thoughts. There are many thoughts that pass through our minds each day. Many more could come if we were interested in them. But we give certain ones some credence. We have some investment. It feels like us, kind of. Even our favorite thoughts, those especially, right? Sometimes those can be destructive. Sometimes they may not quite seem so. So taking a step back and allowing those thoughts to pass by and trying and allowing ourselves to believe in something deeper for the moment. That what we should center on isn't necessarily that passing judgment, but a deep awareness of the I am of God. I think this is a place where we can trip up as well. Because I think when we think about meditating on God, we may not feel like we can live up to it. We may wish that God would appear, because that would make it easier. But indeed, the scriptures tell us, Christ showed us that God is closer to each of us than our idea of ourselves. That's a projection. God is here, is present, before the thought. When we were babies, had nothing to analyze, no words to put to it. God was there with us. Is God distant from us, from our sense of being? Is God distant? Is God far? I don't believe so. And so in a way, a resurrection of God in our lives is more about just realizing what's been true all along, that God was never dead. God was never dead. Body's dead. Yes, Jesus' body is dead. They define death by cardiac arrest if the heart never beats again. They didn't check his pulse at the resurrection, but perhaps it was beating again. Our modern doctors would say, well, there was something strange going on, but he didn't die the first time. Even if it were a year later, and they had, I don't need to go too far into it, but they had watched him decay, and then suddenly he came back, they would say, well, it's a miracle of science, which in a way it is. Science is the description of our universe, how beautifully things come together, work so perfectly to allow for some sense of peace, even when we're not in a state of peace. It gives us room to be disjointed, weirdly enough. It gives us room to be identified with some of the worst thoughts we can imagine, whatever that is. But that in itself allows us the call and the journey, allows us the opportunity to turn towards our natural state of unity with God. Those tough moments, those tough ideas, those things that you beat yourself up about, if you have anything like that, or maybe just a sense of uncomfortability, can be a call to turn within. Just noticing, I'm aware of this idea. I don't have to identify so much with it. I'm even aware of the person that I think I am, reacting to this idea in a way. It's strange. We can feel that sense of limitation in ourselves at times. Identification with the body and what we think we look like even, stuff like that. Could be anything almost. And as we become more aware of just the sense of being behind all of that, more aware that we're aware of these things, we start to find a place within, at least the sages say, that was never caught up in them. We start to uncover what Swedenborg might call our angelic nature. The part of us that's one with God because everything about it is from God, because it's full of gifts, goodness, life, love. Indeed, the destructive things in a way are from God as well, but they're not expressions of God. They don't point to God. They're meant to learn from, unfortunately. It can be tough to learn from these things. But it's an invitation. It's an invitation, it's a reminder when it's tough that there is somewhere higher we can turn. And so let's take a moment. Turning towards the transcendent Lord, words won't do this justice. So let's just open our hearts and minds. As we set aside our thoughts, what's there? Is it something we've had to work for? Is it unpleasant? The Lord's resurrection points to the hope of life after death for many. I think that's reasonable. I think about the afterlife and I think about the resurrection. I think about Swedenborg's book, Heaven and Hell, considered the first Western book of the dead, strangely enough. And how there's so many peoples in heavens, according to Swedenborg. In the heavens, there's culture after culture, all of the spirits, the beings from this planet and others, willing to center on love and truth in their own way. So there's diverse cultural expressions. And I have to think that not everyone there, or maybe it's gotten around, probably has, approaches Easter in the same exact way. Approaches the idea of the resurrection of this human being on planet Earth in the same exact way. But they must all understand resurrection. They indeed, in heaven, are resurrected in a sense. Embodies more real than our own in Swedenborg's mind because they express what we're like on the inside. What we're like on the inside. But the resurrection for me right now is about right now. About an invitation towards health, towards love and community, towards allowing it, embracing it, letting go of the pressure we often put on ourselves and others, even if it's to save the world, even if it's to save the world. Because the sun shines without trying, and a human, I believe, shines without trying. When we let go of the projections and our limited idea of self and open to the lights of love and truth, the core of each of us.
This is a really beautiful song. It's called Where Have All the Flowers Gone? It's by Pete Seeger. If you know any of the words, obviously you're more than welcome to sing along. It's a really beautiful song. Where have all the flowers gone? Long time passing. Where have all the flowers gone? Long time ago. Where have all the flowers gone? Young girls have picked them, every one. When will we ever learn? When will we ever learn? Where have all the flowers gone? Long time ago. Where have all the flowers gone? Long time ago. Where have all the young girls gone? They've come with questions, everyone. When will we ever learn? When will we ever?